He returned 3 letters without opening them. 3 times the exact same envelope came back by the hands of the very same postman, perfectly intact, without a single extra crease, without a fingerprint to prove that he had at least hesitated before sending it back. 3 times she held that returned paper and said absolutely nothing to anyone. 3 times she placed the envelope in the drawer beneath the counter, stared at the closed wooden panel for a moment, and went back to baking bread as if nothing had happened. But the 4th letter did not come back. The 4th letter arrived in an envelope that smelled of a hot oven, of living yeast, of butter melting slowly over a golden crust, and before his hands could even decide what to do with that piece of paper, something far older and far deeper than any conscious decision had already decided for him. Have you ever sent something so true, so painfully sincere, that the only thing capable of destroying it was the silence on the other end? Have you ever stood there holding a piece of paper that was simultaneously the bravest and the most foolish thing you had ever done, and yet you still couldn't bring yourself to throw it away? Have you ever written to someone who returned it, and then you wrote again, and they returned it again, and you wrote a 3rd time, because there was something deep inside you that understood that his silence was not the same thing as a real answer? She sent it 4 times, and the 4th time changed everything. This happened in October of 1934, in a small town in the heart of Pennsylvania called Oak Creek. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's name, where the local gossip always arrived before the people involved, where other people's problems were everybody's business, and where the smell of baking bread from a certain bakery on Main Street was capable of stopping anyone right in their tracks, from whichever direction the wind happened to blow, just for the sheer pleasure of breathing in that air for 1 second longer. Before we go on, let me ask you a quick favor, all right? If you are watching this video right now, from wherever you might be, tell me down below in the comments what city you are watching from. It could be a big, bustling city, it could be a tiny little place out in the countryside, or it could even be from another country. I absolutely love knowing where the folks who follow these stories here on the channel come from, and it helps me so much to keep bringing these tales to you every single week. Go ahead and write the name of your town and your state in the comments. Don't be shy at all. And if you aren't subscribed to the channel yet, make sure to subscribe right now and ring that little bell so you don't miss any new stories. Now let's get back to Oak Creek, to that crisp October of 1934, and to a woman who baked the finest bread in the valley and who possessed the most honest stubbornness you will ever encounter in this story. Clara Hastings woke up every single day at 4 in the morning, not because she needed to force an alarm clock to ring, not because there was anyone there to wake her up, and not because logic dictated this hour as the most reasonable time to start the day. She woke up at 4 in the morning because her body had learned the hour of the oven in the exact same way a bird learns the hour of the sunrise, by absolute necessity, by endless repetition, by a memory that runs so much deeper than conscious thought, one that asks for no permission and accepts no arguments. At 4 in the morning, without an alarm, without a sound, without a single thing changing in the world outside, Clara Hastings' eyes would simply open, and her body already knew exactly what to do. She would rise from her little room in the back of the bakery, a modest space with a high window that let in only a narrow slice of the sky, splash cold water on her face in a ritual that lasted no more than 30 seconds, tie her wavy brown hair into a loose bun that invariably began to undo itself before noon, because it was the kind of bun a woman makes when she isn't thinking about her hair, but rather about the work that needs to be done, and then she would tie her apron. The apron had belonged to her father before her, a piece of raw cotton with blue stripes so faded that in certain angles of light it simply looked white, sewn by her mother in a time when her mother was still around to sew things. This apron smelled of yeast, even right after it was washed. There was a concentration of sheer life in that scent that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. the kind of lasting presence an object acquires when it has been in close contact with what truly matters for a long enough time. Hastings' Bakery was located on Main Street, which was the central artery of Oak Creek, and it was a low building with thick, whitewashed walls, the paint always peeling just a little at the corners where the harsh winter winds hit the hardest, and a large window facing the street through which the scent of the oven escaped on frosty mornings. Outside, there was a dark wooden bench, polished smooth by the use of decades of customers who had sat there to wait for their bread, or simply to watch the movement of the street with that tranquil peace that only exists in places where time seems to move at a completely different speed than the rushed pace of the modern world. Inside, the varnished wooden counter sat to the left as you walked in. The shelves laden with loaves, buttermilk rolls, biscuits and crumb cakes were on the right, and at the very back was the oven door, which, in the specific language of that house, was not just any door, it was the beating heart of the place. Oliver Hastings had opened that bakery in 1901 when he was 27 years old, with a newlywed wife and a recipe for sharp cheddar pull-apart bread written in a black leather notebook that his wife's mother had given them as a wedding gift. He had learned to bake bread with his own mother on a farm out in Lancaster County, and he had brought that knowledge to the town as if it were a precious inheritance, which, in fact, it was. His wife, whose name was Teresa, had quick, nimble hands and an instinct for temperature that Oliver always claimed was far better than his own. And the two of them had built the bakery together in those early years with that specific, magical combination of hard work and deep affection that makes things last. When Teresa passed away from a sudden fever 3 years later, leaving Oliver with the bakery, a modest pile of debts, and a 2-year-old daughter who napped in the intervals between one batch and the next, he had decided that the only possible answer to his grief was to keep going, and so he did. Clara grew up surrounded by flour and the heat of the oven before she grew up among words and numbers. She learned the trade long before she learned to read fluently, developing an intuitive, sensory intelligence in her fingertips and her nose that simply could not be taught, only lived. She knew when the yeast was alive before anything else could possibly reveal it. She knew when the oven had reached the perfect temperature by the way the heat rose up to greet her when she opened the door, by the exact shade the stone in the back had turned, by the distinct aroma the hot chamber released in the very first seconds. She knew when the bread was perfectly done by the crust, by an almost imperceptible shift in color that moved from a light gold to a rich, dense amber in the span of 2 short minutes. The tiny window that made all the difference between the perfect loaf and a loaf that had been pushed just a bit too far. It was a bodily, physical knowledge, something that predated reason, the sort of thing you cannot fully explain, but which produces results that people feel immediately, even if they don't know exactly how to name what they are feeling. They just called it delicious. But it was so much more than that. 2 years before the October when this story begins, Oliver had fallen ill with lung trouble. Not all of a sudden, not in one brutal strike, but in that creeping way an illness behaves when it has decided to stick around. A cough that started small and slowly grew more persistent, a shortness of breath when carrying the heavy sacks of flour that he used to hoist like they were nothing, a bone-deep weariness that a good night's sleep couldn't completely fix. The town doctor had ordered him to stop working the ovens, and Oliver had obeyed with a stubborn reluctance that resulted in nearly 6 months of arguments with his daughter, 6 months of trying to convince her that he was perfectly fine and that the oven needed him, before he finally, with the intact dignity of a man who accepts the inevitable without fully bending to it, acknowledged that his aging body could no longer handle the grueling early mornings. Since then, he lived in a rented room in the house right next door, and he would show up at the bakery every morning around 7 o'clock to sit on the wooden bench out front, drink the black coffee that Clara always left waiting for him in a large mug, and watch the bustle of Main Street with the quiet serenity of a man who has seen enough of the world to no longer feel the need to chase after it. He still gave his opinions on the bread. That never stopped, and Clara never expected it to stop, nor did she ever want it to stop, because over time she had come to understand that those opinions were the way her father had found to continue participating in something that had been his entire life. Taking that away from him would mean stripping away something far more vital than a mere suggestion about the perfect crust or the right pinch of salt. Clara's life, in that crisp October of 1934, took the shape of a life well crafted, full of honest work, of undeniable usefulness, of familiar relationships, and of a reliable routine that she had built with her own two hands and that worked beautifully. But nestled quietly inside that well-crafted life, there was a low-intensity absence, a sort of hollow space she had learned to inhabit without ever complaining. The kind of thing you just don't mention because everyone has their own version of it, and because mentioning it doesn't fix it anyway. She was 28 years old, pretty in a natural way that she herself rarely ever noticed, because her eyes were always focused on whatever task was at hand, and 2 years earlier she had turned down a marriage proposal from a man named Henry, who was a good, hard-working fellow and who loved her with a steadfast devotion that she recognized as entirely real. The problem with Henry was simple and absolute. She just didn't love him back in that way. And Clara had decided at a very young age, after watching her father talk about her departed mother with that specific enduring warmth that the passage of time had never managed to cool, that there was a single, non-negotiable criterion she refused to abandon. She described it to herself in very simple terms: the feeling that makes you wake up at 4 in the morning thinking about someone without meaning to, without reason, without there being any pending chore to justify the thought. If it wasn't that specific feeling, she vastly preferred the solitary comfort of her ovens, and until that fateful Friday in October when she went down to the farmer's market, she had sometimes wondered if her standard wasn't perhaps a bit too severe. After that Friday at the market, she never wondered about it again. Oak Creek hosted a farmer's market every Friday in the town square, a tradition so deeply rooted that no one alive remembered when it had actually started, the kind of thing that simply existed the way the stones and the river existed, predating the memory of any living soul. Farmers from the surrounding countryside would arrive bearing fresh farmer's cheese, dark molasses, sweet preserves, peppers of every size, and chickens in wooden crates whose occupants didn't seem to appreciate the trip, but were an inseparable part of the scenery. Travelling merchants arrived with varied dry goods, and the townspeople arrived in droves, not necessarily armed with shopping lists, but because the market was the hub where the entire week concentrated itself, where you bumped into the people you had successfully avoided all week and the ones you had been longing to see, where the local news circulated with a speed inversely proportional to the size of the town, which was small enough that any fresh rumour reached every single ear before sundown. Clara went to the market every Friday right after closing the bakery at noon. She would wash her hands meticulously, untie her faded apron, secure the loose strands of hair that had escaped during her morning's labour, and walk the 3 short blocks to the square with those firm, purposeful steps of someone who is entirely used to having solid ground beneath her feet without ever needing to look down at it. Her usual destination was the fresh cheese stall run by Mrs. Gable, a woman with calloused hands and a wonderfully generous smile, whose slightly aged cheddar possessed a consistency that Clara had carefully integrated into her father's cheddar bread recipe after years of meticulous experimentation, and which had no equal anywhere else. Sometimes she would also buy canned peaches from Mr. Abernathy, who had a remarkable peach tree in his backyard that produced far more than his family could ever eat, and who had discovered decades ago that canned peaches sold exceptionally well at the market, a piece of wisdom he had passed down to his children and grandchildren with the solemn gravity of a family legacy. On that particular Friday in October, the market was far more crowded than usual because of a rumor that a traveling merchant from Pittsburgh had brought in imported fabrics, which in a place like Oak Creek was an event of considerable proportions. Clara had no particular interest in fabrics, but she went anyway because the market was the market, and to not go would mean missing out on something she couldn't quite name, but would certainly feel the absence of. She had just picked up her wrapped wedge of cheese from Mrs. Gable and was tucking it carefully into her woven basket when she heard Mrs. Higgins's voice right behind her, carrying that specific, breathless urgency of someone who has something incredible to show and believes the other person absolutely must see it immediately. Mrs. Higgins was the town's seamstress, 55 years old, a short and round woman possessing a sheer volume of information about Oak Creek that could rival the town hall's filing cabinets. She didn't speak ill of people exactly, but she spoke absolutely everything about people, with a genuine democratic enthusiasm that made it practically impossible to stay mad at her because she was so clearly driven by affection rather than malice. Mrs. Higgins pointed discreetly, with that classic gesture of someone pointing without seeming to point, which is actually the most obvious gesture in the world, toward a man standing on the far side of the square. And that was exactly how Clara Hastings saw Robert Bradley for the very first time. She wouldn't be able to say later what exactly made her stop in her tracks. It wasn't his height, nor the broad shoulders that his tailored coat covered, but couldn't entirely hide. It wasn't the dark fedora tipped at an angle that looked less like an affectation and more like a deeply ingrained habit. It was something about the sheer way he stood, a specific quality of presence that she registered before processing a single physical detail. He seemed to occupy a completely different space than everyone else, not physically, but in some other profound way she couldn't articulate. It was as if the lively market was happening all around him, and he was merely standing on the absolute edge of it all, observing everything from an angle slightly different from everyone else's. He wore an expression that Clara, watching from across the square, mentally classified as strictly controlled. It wasn't coldness, it was absolute containment, the stark difference between an oven that has gone cold and an oven that has been sealed from the inside with all the blistering heat still trapped within. He was standing in profile to her, looking out toward the river, and there was something in the rigid set of his jaw that she recognized instantly, because she had seen it on her own father's face in certain difficult moments, the face of a man who has returned to a place after a very long time and is silently, rigorously doing the math between what he remembered and what he has actually found. Mrs. Higgins did not stop talking while Clara stared. She said that was Robert Bradley, son of the late Arthur Bradley, who had lived out at Maple Ridge Farm until the bank seized everything back in 1921. She said he was just a young boy when that tragedy happened, that he had left shortly after for Chicago, that he had worked construction, that he had saved up a small fortune, and that he had returned 6 months ago and bought the family farm back, paying for the deed in cash without owing a single red cent to anyone. She said the whole town knew about it. She said the whole town found it either incredibly admirable or terribly arrogant, depending on exactly who you talked to, and that she personally found it to be both things at the exact same time. Clara listened to all of this with only half her attention. The other half was entirely anchored on the man in the dark hat, who at that precise moment had turned and was looking over the bustling square, and then toward the bread stall that Tommy, her young assistant, had set up nearby, because on Fridays she always sent fresh loaves to the market as well, and then his eyes swept past her with the casualness of someone registering a presence without truly examining it, and he began walking straight toward the bread stall. She should have just walked away. Instead, she stood completely still. Tommy was a 16-year-old boy, remarkably skilled with the ovens, but afflicted with a shyness around customers that forced him to stare intently at his own shoes during almost every transaction. He was currently assisting Robert and staring intensely at his scuffed boots when Clara stepped up from behind the makeshift counter. Robert was asking for 2 cheddar rolls with the blunt objectivity of a man making a purely practical purchase, utterly lacking the sort of hesitation some folks display at a bakery counter as if they were making a life-altering decision. Clara grabbed the wax paper, wrapped the 2 rolls in 2 swift, practiced movements, and told him the price was 20 cents. Robert Bradley looked up at her. It lasted 3 seconds, maybe 4. It wasn't a lingering look. It wasn't the kind of gaze from a romantic movie where time magically stops and the background music swells. It was a direct, assessing look from a person who truly processes, who is standing in front of them with genuine attention. A woman in a faded blue striped apron, her hair slightly escaping its bun, her warm brown eyes looking right back without faltering. Clara didn't look away because it simply wasn't in her nature to shy away from anyone's gaze. She looked at people the exact same way she looked at her ovens, with deep attention, without any rushed judgment, waiting patiently to see what was truly, authentically there. He paid the coins, thanked her with a brief, sharp nod that wasn't dismissive but certainly wasn't lingering, and walked away. Tommy turned to her, his eyes wide, and whispered that that was the man who owned Maple Ridge Farm. Clara replied quietly that she knew. He asked if she knew him personally. She said no, but she spent the entire rest of the afternoon thinking about him, not in a feverish, fluttery way. She thought about him in the same exact way you think about a haunting melody you heard only in passing and don't know the name of. A tune that occupies a corner of your mind with a stubborn persistence completely out of proportion to the brevity of the encounter. She walked back to the bakery, finished her afternoon chores, chatted with her father, who was sitting on the bench outside with his coffee waiting for him just as always. And during that entire conversation about the week's sales and about a new recipe for cornmeal loaves that Oliver was itching to try again, a distinct part of Clara's mind kept returning to the broad span of Robert Bradley's shoulders and to the expression she had mentally labelled as a sealed oven. And then she found herself dwelling on his last name, Bradley. She knew that name. Oliver was in higher spirits than usual that evening. He had sat outside the bakery longer than was his custom, and when Clara finally went to fetch him for dinner, his weathered face wore that specific, gentle look of a man who's been reliving good memories, a look she instantly recognized and which always warmed something deep inside her, because her father's good memories were also the most precious records of a life she hadn't fully witnessed but had inherited in pieces. They ate dinner together in the small back room that also served as a makeshift office, right at the table where Clara meticulously paid the bakery's bills every fortnight. It was a dark wooden table covered with a fine linen cloth that Oliver stubbornly insisted on using for dinner, even on ordinary weekdays, because he firmly believed that a simple meal deserved a good tablecloth just as much as a grand feast did. It was during this dinner, with the casual naturalness of someone asking a question that just popped into their head, that Clara asked about the Bradleys. Oliver slowly set down his fork. He furrowed his brow slightly, the classic gesture of a man mentally sorting through an old drawer of memories to find the exact right file. And then he spoke, his voice taking on that measured, deliberate pace he used when he wanted to be perfectly precise. The Bradleys of Maple Ridge Farm were good, honest folks, he said. Arthur Bradley had been one of the bakery's most loyal customers for nearly 20 years, ordering fresh bread every single week without fail, never once late on a payment, and he made it a point to ride into town personally once a month to pick up the large order instead of sending a farmhand, a gesture Oliver had always deeply appreciated because it showed a genuine respect for a man's labor that not every wealthy landowner possessed. When the bank mercilessly took the property back in 1921, Oliver said he felt as if he had lost a dear neighbor, not just a customer, because there was a vast difference between those two things, and he had always known exactly how to distinguish them. And then he added something with a precision of detail that caught Clara completely off guard. He remembered the wake of Arthur's wife, years prior. He had sent a large basket of fresh bread to the grieving family that day because that was simply what he knew how to do in the face of other people's sorrow, to send bread, to offer something tangible, warm and real, because sometimes hollow words just cannot reach the deep places where warmth can. Clara stared down at the rich broth in her bowl. "So he's been eating bread from this oven since he was a little boy," she murmured, speaking more to herself than to him. Oliver nodded and said yes. Not only did he eat it, but he distinctly recalled one particular afternoon when Arthur had brought the boy along to pick up the bread because their usual delivery man had taken ill. The boy had stood frozen in front of the open oven door, watching the flames with a profound attention that Oliver had found endearing because it was so rare to see in a child that young. Oliver remembered handing the boy a fresh piece of bread straight from the blazing oven, slathered in melting butter, and how the boy had eaten it with his eyes completely squeezed shut, as if that were the absolute best moment of his entire day. Clara didn't say another word about the matter for the rest of the evening, but when she went to bed, she lay awake for a very, very long time. She lay there in her dark room, listening to the mountain wind slipping through the window, that honest, biting chill of a Pennsylvania October, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the small town she knew so intimately that she heard them without really hearing them. A dog barking far off in the distance, the church bell tolling 10 o'clock, the scuff of slow footsteps on the cobblestone sidewalk outside. She lay there thinking about the man who had bought 2 cheddar rolls at the farmer's market with the blunt objectivity of someone making a practical purchase, who had looked right back at her for 3 whole seconds without looking away, who had walked off without a goodbye but also without any rush. She lay there thinking that he had grown up eating her father's bread, that he had lost his mother and someone had sent warm bread on that terrible day, that he had lost his family's farm, vanished for 15 hard years, and returned to reclaim what was rightfully his, deed paid in full, owing nothing to anyone. She lay there thinking about the expression she had called a sealed oven, and realizing that a sealed oven was absolutely not a cold oven. At 4 in the morning, her body woke her up just as it always did, and she went to light the fires. But before she struck the match, she stood perfectly still in the dark kitchen for a long moment, holding the matchbox in her hand, the cold, sharp scent of dormant yeast and stone wrapping around her, thinking that there was something about that man that felt important in a way she didn't quite know how to name yet. Then she lit the oven. She baked the bread. But there was something distinctly different that morning, a quiet quality of absolute attention that she poured into her hands as she worked the dough, as if the living bread somehow knew that the woman kneading it was thinking about something that hadn't quite taken its true shape yet. The first letter took 3 entire days to write, not because Clara was an indecisive person in the usual sense of the word. It was almost the exact opposite. She was so incredibly direct in everything she did, so used to simply acting the moment she decided to act, that her struggle wasn't in starting, but in finding the exact right tone, the perfect balance between what she desperately wanted to say and what was actually appropriate to say to a man she had only seen for 10 minutes in her entire life. She knew perfectly well that writing to a man she barely knew without any obvious practical reason was exactly the sort of thing the whole town would talk about if they ever found out. But there were things far more important than town gossip, and Clara possessed enough good sense to know when something fell into that rare category. The first draft went straight into the trash because it sounded far too pretentious. The second went out because it was too stiff, bearing the protocolary coldness of a business letter, when what she was trying to convey was anything but business. The third draft was scrapped because it sounded as if she were asking for a favor, and she wasn't asking for anything at all. The fourth draft, written on a quiet Wednesday afternoon while the loaves were baking in the oven and the intoxicating smell of crust warmed the entire bakery, came out entirely different from the others. It came out simple. She wrote that her name was Clara Hastings, daughter of Oliver Hastings, the owner of Hastings Bakery on Main Street. She wrote that she had heard he was Arthur Bradley's son, and that her father had proudly supplied bread to Maple Ridge Farm for nearly 20 years. She wrote that she hadn't been able to stop thinking, ever since the day of the market, about a story Oliver had told her, that when his mother had passed away, someone had sent fresh bread to the grieving family, that someone had been her father, because baking was the only thing he knew how to do when words simply weren't enough. She wrote that she didn't know if he was aware of that, but she felt it was something he might want to know. And then, almost by accident, she added one extra sentence. She stared at it for a long moment with her pen hovering in the air, seriously considering crossing it out. But she didn't cross it out because it was the absolute truth, and striking out truths in a letter was a kind of cowardice she refused to entertain. She wrote that she had really liked the way he had looked at the bread at the stall before ordering, with a deep attention she recognized instantly, because it was the rare attention of someone who truly understands what they are looking at, and that this was far rarer than people thought. She signed it with her full name. She folded it, slid it into the envelope, and wrote the address for Maple Ridge Farm in the firm, steady handwriting her father had insisted she practice since she was a little girl, always telling her that good handwriting was a sign of deep respect for the reader. She sealed the envelope. She stood there holding it in her hand for a long moment, there at the counter of the empty bakery on that Wednesday afternoon, the sunlight through the window casting a bright rectangle on the brick floor, the thick aroma of bread occupying every single inch of the air. Then she marched straight to the post office before she could change her mind. The letter came back in 6 days. Clara knew something was wrong before she even saw it, just by the hesitant way Tommy called out to her that Thursday morning, his voice carrying the guilty weight of someone delivering a message they aren't sure they should be delivering, as if the bad news were somehow his fault. The envelope was sitting quietly on the wooden counter when she walked into the front of the bakery, the exact same envelope she had sent, bearing her own handwriting on the front, perfectly intact, without a single new crease, without any mark to suggest it had ever passed through hands that even considered opening it. There was only the small, stark red stamp from the post office in the corner, marking it as returned. Clara stared down at the envelope for a few silent seconds, her face settling into that specific expression she wore when processing something she hadn't yet decided how to handle. Then she calmly picked it up, walked to the back of the bakery, checked the temperature of the oven, and tucked the envelope into the drawer beneath the counter without a single word. Mrs. Higgins knew about it in 2 days. Not the actual contents of the letter, of course, but the bare fact that it had been mailed and returned because Oak Creek was exactly the size of town where the postmaster knew everybody, and where knowing everybody meant knowing absolutely everything without anyone ever needing to confess a word. She bustled into the bakery on a Saturday morning, wearing that specific look of someone who is deeply concerned, but also slightly energized by the sheer drama of the situation, and asked her point blank if the rumor was true. Clara looked at her and said it was true. Mrs. Higgins immediately launched into an explanation, saying that the man didn't answer correspondence from a single soul, that the Reverend had tried to invite him to the Founders' Day picnic, and that envelope had come back unopened too. She said he was a difficult, closed-off man who had come back with pockets full of money but zero interest in society, and that the entire town had already come to this firm conclusion. She delivered this verdict with a potent mixture of genuine pity and final judgment, the absolute hallmark of those overbearing affections that love you dearly, but love you best when they have a ready-made diagnosis for your life. Clara calmly poured her a cup of coffee, listened to every word, and kept her thoughts entirely to herself. What she was actually thinking was that a window that has been locked from the inside is still a window, and that she knew an awful lot about opening ovens. The second letter was written exactly 2 weeks after the first. This time, there were no discarded drafts. On a quiet Sunday night, with the bakery closed and her father sound asleep, and the town's electric lights making their traditional Sunday night disappearance for reasons the mayor had never satisfactorily explained, Clara sat at the table with a lit candle and wrote it all in one go. She wrote that she knew he had returned the first letter without opening it, and that he had every absolute right in the world to do so. She wrote that she wasn't trying to be a nuisance, but she also wrote that there was a story that kept returning to her mind, the story her father had told about an afternoon when Arthur Bradley had come to the bakery with a little boy, and how that boy had stood completely mesmerized in front of the open oven, staring into the fire with a profound attention that Oliver had found endearing, because it was the kind of knowing attention adults possess, and that rarely shows up in someone so young. She wrote that Oliver had handed the boy a hot piece of bread straight from the fire, slathered in butter, and that the boy had eaten it in absolute silence, with his eyes squeezed tightly shut. She wrote that she couldn't be entirely certain that little boy was him, but she would bet her bakery on it. And then, in the very last part of the letter, she wrote something that she only realized was deeply profound, right as her pen formed the final word. She wrote that there were days when she baked the bread and found herself thinking about who was going to eat it, and that this was perhaps the most honest thing she could ever say about her life's work, that every single loaf was made with someone in mind. And that lately she had found herself thinking of him without fully understanding why, but with a quiet regularity that she had completely stopped trying to ignore. She sealed the envelope and went to sleep. The letter came back in 4 days. Faster than the first one. No note, just stubbornly returned. Clara placed it in the exact same drawer. She sat out on the wooden bench in front of the bakery for a full hour that afternoon, the crisp October sun warming the left side of her face, while her regular customers walked by and offered their greetings. And she greeted them right back with an easy naturalness that served as a protective shell over what she was actually feeling underneath. What she was feeling underneath was something she fiercely refused to call defeat, because it wasn't defeat. It was resistance. And she had learned from a very young age that resistance is completely different from impossibility. Sometimes the thing you are trying to force open simply hasn't found the right point of entry yet. But it cost her. It would be a lie to say it didn't hurt. That week, Oak Creek did exactly what small towns do with the lives of the people they care about. It offered its unsolicited opinions. Mr. Davis, the pharmacist, declared loudly in the barbershop that Clara was wasting her precious youth on a man who had clearly chosen to be a hermit. Miss Edith, the schoolteacher, told her older pupils that there was something she called noble dignity in the persistence of someone who truly believes. The Reverend, who had suffered the same fate with his picnic invitation, delivered a Sunday sermon, noting that not all closed doors are locked from the inside. Mrs. Higgins, with that brutal honesty that was devastating exactly because it was so incredibly well-intentioned, told Clara that she needed to stop before she ended up breaking her own heart for absolutely nothing. Clara carefully wrapped Mrs. Higgins's loaf of cornbread, handed over the change, and calmly replied that if Mrs. Higgins had quit going to Sunday service every time the Reverend gave a boring sermon, she would have stopped going 20 years ago. Mrs. Higgins turned bright red, then let out a sharp laugh and said that was entirely different. Clara smiled and said she wasn't so sure. After the woman left, Clara stood alone in the quiet shop and walked over to the drawer. She pulled out the two envelopes, both flawlessly intact, bearing her own handwriting on the front, as if they were cruel mirrors reflecting only what she had sent out, and she stared at them for a long moment. There was something deeply unsettling about holding a letter you poured your soul into, knowing no one had ever read it. It was like speaking into an empty room. The words existed. They were right there in every fold of the paper, but they hadn't actually reached anywhere. And then she thought of something that completely surprised her with its logic. He hadn't thrown them away. He had actively returned them. There was a massive difference between those two actions, a difference she felt as deeply significant even before she could articulate exactly why. A man who simply didn't care at all would have tossed the envelope straight into the fire. A man who took the time to return it was doing something else entirely, something she couldn't fully name, but which she felt in her bones was fundamentally different from apathy. She placed the envelopes back, firmly closed the drawer, and went back to prepare the afternoon dough. The third letter was the hardest one of all. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew entirely too much and had to choose her words with painstaking care. A third letter, following two rejected ones, was dangerous territory where her honesty needed to be surgical, where every single word needed to be exactly what it was without being a drop more. Without ever sounding like pressure or a desperate plea, because she wasn't pressuring him, and she certainly wasn't begging. She was merely trying to reach something that hadn't yet found the right path in. She wrote it on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The ovens finally cooled down, sitting in the silent bakery while the light outside faded, a forgotten cup of cold coffee sitting beside her because she had been concentrating too hard to remember to drink it. She wrote that she completely understood he had returned two letters, and that returning them was indeed an answer, just not one made of words. She wrote that she deeply respected the fortress he had chosen to build around himself. But then she wrote, with that piercing frankness that was her most unyielding trait, that she didn't know exactly why she kept writing, and that this lack of understanding bothered her, because she was a woman accustomed to knowing the exact reasons for her own actions. She wrote that there was something in that brief 10-minute encounter at the market that had planted a formless question in her mind, a question she couldn't fully articulate, but which was sitting right there, taking up space, stubbornly refusing to leave. She wrote that she wasn't asking for a single thing, that she didn't want anything from him that he didn't freely want to give. Only that there was something profound making her unable to give up just yet. She ended it by saying that if he returned this one too, she would finally respect his silence and never write again. She sealed it and went to sleep. The letter came back in 3 days, but this time it came with a note. It was a single folded sheet of plain paper, completely unadorned, covered in a tense, tightly controlled handwriting, the handwriting of a man who chooses every single word with the grueling precision of someone who simply has no words to waste. The note read, "I have no interest in correspondence. Please do not write again." Clara read it twice. She folded the note back up with slow, deliberate care. She slipped it inside the third envelope right next to her unread letter. She closed the drawer, and she stood completely still in the empty bakery for a very long time. Outside, the afternoon was beautiful in the exact way October was always beautiful in Oak Creek. The sun carried that heavy, dense gold of the changing seasons that only lasted a few short weeks, when the blistering heat of summer was a distant memory, and the mountain chill had relented just enough to leave the air crisp, clean, and glowing like pale honey. Through the open windows of the bakery, the familiar sounds of the street drifted in, a heavy farm wagon rolling slowly by, voices chatting casually on the sidewalk next door, the church bells striking 4 o'clock with that comforting exactness of things that never, ever make mistakes. Clara Hastings sat on the wooden stool behind her counter, her hands resting quietly in her lap, staring intensely at the closed drawer. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry either, which would have been so much easier. She was gripped by that much deeper, heavier thing that precedes both tears and anger, that silent, crushing weight that settles in your chest when you have to decide whether to turn your back on something forever, or to stand and face it a while longer without knowing what on earth that will mean. It was the kind of agonizing moment that doesn't demand immediate action, but simply demands that you endure standing inside it without rushing to solve it prematurely. She sat exactly like that for almost an hour. Then she finally stood up, walked over to her father's rented room, ate dinner with him, listened to Oliver's old stories with an attention that felt sharper and more present that night than usual, and went to bed. And for the very first time in weeks, she didn't lie awake thinking about Robert Bradley before she closed her eyes. October drifted on. Clara baked her bread exactly as always, unlocked and locked the bakery doors as always, ordered flour, paid her bills, greeted her loyal customers by their first names, attended Sunday church services, and listened to Mrs. Higgins chatter endlessly about absolutely everyone. The life of Oak Creek marched forward with that soothing, unstoppable regularity of small towns that halt for nothing and rush for nothing, keeping the steady rhythm of the passing seasons rather than the frantic pulse of modern urgency. She did not write to Robert Bradley. 1 week passed, then another. The wooden drawer holding the 3 envelopes and the terse note remained firmly shut. But there were days, especially in the freezing early hours of the morning, when she was entirely alone with the roaring oven and the living dough in her hands, that a thought would flicker through her mind, something she couldn't quite pin down. It wasn't regret, because she knew she had done exactly what she felt was right. It wasn't resentment, because a man has the absolute right to refuse correspondence. It felt much more like the lingering ache of a story that had stopped right in the middle, exactly like a loaf of bread pulled from the oven before its time. It exists, it has been made, but there is a tragic incompleteness to it that anyone who truly understands baking can sense immediately. It was on a quiet Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after receiving Robert's blunt note, that her father arrived much earlier than usual, clutching the worn, black leather notebook of Clara's mother's old recipes. That precious notebook rarely made an appearance, and whenever it did, it was a sure sign that Oliver was feeling a deep yearning to try something incredibly special, to resurrect something that had been safely tucked away for years. He announced that he wanted to try baking the sweet fennel and smoked bacon loaf that Teresa always used to make when the frost set in. He said he had lain awake, thinking about her all night, experiencing that beautiful, painful way good memories sometimes flood back with a clarity that makes them feel like they happened just yesterday. He asked Clara to bake it with him. They stood side by side in the warm kitchen all morning, Oliver perched on a small stool with the open notebook resting on his knees, reading the faded ingredients aloud in his slow, measured voice, while Clara stood at the flowered wooden bench, mixing, feeling the texture of the dough, discussing the exact consistency with him, debating the right moment for the yeast, wondering aloud if the amount of fennel Teresa actually used was perhaps a pinch more than what she had written down, because the measure in the book seemed far too conservative for the rich flavor Oliver vividly remembered. The great ovens steadily heated the kitchen air, the sweet, earthy scent of fennel mingling perfectly with the bakery's deep, foundational aromas, and there was a very specific, magical quality to that morning, to that shared conversation, that Clara would later struggle to describe fully, but which she felt as something profoundly important the very moment she was living it. And it was right there, with her hands buried deep in the dough in the middle of that morning, that the thought finally arrived. It wasn't planned. It was the kind of sudden realization that only strikes when you completely stop thinking with your head and start thinking with your hands. What if the fourth letter wasn't about her at all? Clara froze. her flour-covered hands motionless in the dough, staring blankly at the wall. Her father asked her what was wrong. She quickly blinked and said she was merely evaluating the texture of the dough, that it was almost perfectly ready. Oliver smiled and said it looked wonderful, that it was time to let it rest. She set the dough aside to rise, and she stood there thinking fiercely. The 3 previous letters had been, each in their own honest way, entirely about her, about what she was feeling, about what she wanted to know, about her relentless stubbornness in refusing to give up. They were deeply honest, they were absolutely true, but they were letters from Clara about Clara. And maybe that was the exact reason they hadn't worked. A man who has painstakingly boarded up every single window in his house doesn't need yet another thing demanding something from him, inviting him to open up, expecting a response. Maybe what he actually needed was something that asked for absolutely nothing, that explained absolutely nothing, something that could slip past his defenses before he even had the chance to decide to lock the door. Something that was just a familiar comfort arriving entirely unexpectedly, something that was just the smell of warm bread. It wasn't a cold, rational deduction. It was a flash of pure intuition that Clara processed in the only way she knew how to process intuition, with her body, with her nose, with that deep sensory intelligence she had cultivated over a lifetime of working the ovens. She knew, as a matter of fact, that the scent of baking bread travels faster than reason. She knew that there were potent memories living strictly in the sense of smell, sleeping quietly in the dark for decades until the exact right aroma woke them up. And she knew, from every story her father had ever told her, that the bread from Hastings' bakery had been present at the most crucial moments of that family's life. It had been there at a funeral. It had been there on a random afternoon when a little boy had eaten a hot slice with his eyes squeezed shut. If there was one single language Robert Bradley understood before his mind could tell him to reject it, it was that one. She didn't say a word to anyone. She finished baking the sweet fennel loaf with her father, who was immensely satisfied with the rich result and proudly declared it tasted almost exactly like Teresa's, which was the highest possible praise Oliver could ever bestow upon anything edible. After he ambled happily back home, Clara stood alone in her bakery and began to plan. She didn't plan the words of the letter, she planned the oven. If you are enjoying this story so far, please let me know in the comments what you think, all right? Write down exactly what you're feeling, because I truly love reading what you all have to say about these stories. And now, let's continue. The 4th letter was written on a Friday afternoon. Not just any random Friday afternoon, it was a very specific afternoon, the tail end of a Friday where Clara had baked 3 massive batches of bread, starting at 4 in the morning exactly as always and finishing near 2 in the afternoon, so that when she finally flipped the sign on the door to closed and stood alone in the kitchen, the air was in a thick, heavy state that only ever occurred on days of immense production. The brutal heat had spent hours soaking into the thick stone walls, into the heavy wooden beams across the ceiling, into the flour-dusted planks of the counter, into the linen cloths hanging on their hooks by the cast-iron sink, into every single porous surface of a room that had spent decades absorbing the radiant life of an oven. The bakery, in that magical state, didn't just smell like bread. It smelled like every single thing that bread carries within it when it is crafted with deep attention and unhurried time. The living yeast, which has its own wild, almost animalistic scent, the rich wheat flour hitting its hottest point just before it transforms into a crust, the sweet butter that had dripped down the side of a few baking tins and scorched ever so slightly on the oven floor, leaving a dark, beautiful, savory note underneath it all, like the deep bass note in a symphony. And floating above it all, dominating the air exactly the way bright sunlight dominates a dark room the moment a window is thrown open, was the glorious aroma of golden crust. A smell Clara had tried to describe to herself 1,000 times, and which was the closest thing to pure happiness she had ever managed to translate into a scent. She grabbed a sheet of paper from her simple order pad. Not the fancy stationery she had used for the 3 previous letters, not the long formal envelope. It was a simple, slightly yellowed piece of paper, the kind that drinks up fountain pen ink beautifully, a piece of paper that had been sitting right there on the workbench amidst the flour and the suffocating heat of 3 massive baking sessions, a paper that already held within its very fibers the deep memory of the bread she wanted to arrive right alongside her words. She sat down heavily on the wooden stool behind the counter. The fire was out, but the thick stones of the oven still harbored that profound, constant heat that takes hours and hours to dissipate, radiating against her back with an almost physical embrace. The golden afternoon light slanted through the large front window, that specific October light that, in Oak Creek, possessed a dense, honeyed quality, turning the fine flour dust floating in the air into a shimmering mist of gold. The smell was absolutely everywhere, in her tired hands, in her apron, in the loose waves of her hair, which she had finally let down completely after the last customer left, because the bun had completely surrendered and she had simply let it fall. In the heavy air she drew into her lungs with every breath, in the whitewashed walls, in the scarred wood of the counter, in the old wood of the drawer where the 3 rejected envelopes still slept. And she began to write. She didn't plan a single word before she started. She just let the first sentence appear, and the others naturally followed, exactly like dough rising when the yeast is absolutely perfect and you simply give it the space to grow. She wrote that she knew he had explicitly asked her not to write anymore, and that she had respected his wishes for 3 long weeks. She wrote that she wasn't going to ask him to reply, and that she wasn't asking for anything at all. That there was only one final thing she wanted to say. She wrote about her father, about the stories Oliver had shared of the years of weekly deliveries, about the bread sent for the funeral, about the deep respect Arthur Bradley had always shown for the bakery's hard labor. She wrote about that specific afternoon Oliver had described, wearing the gentle smile he saved for his most treasured memories. A tall man walking in with a little boy, the oven door wide open. A rare and profound attention in someone so incredibly young. A hot piece of bread slathered with butter, and a boy who had eaten it with his eyes squeezed completely shut, as if that were the only moment in the entire world that mattered that day. She wrote that she didn't know if it had happened exactly like that, or if her aging father had perhaps embellished the details over time, as good memories tend to do. But she wrote that the image had stuck with her, a little boy eating warm bread with his eyes closed, and that she couldn't help but believe that that little boy had carried that exact feeling somewhere deep inside himself, even if he didn't realize he was still carrying it. Then she wrote, and this part flowed from her pen without a single second of hesitation, that today had been a day of immense baking, that she had pulled 3 huge batches from the fire since 4 in the morning, that the smell filling the bakery at that exact moment was the absolute best smell she knew in the entire world, more honest and true than anything she could ever try to put into words. She wrote that if it were humanly possible to fold that scent and mail it inside an envelope, she would, because she truly believed he had known exactly what that smell meant long before she was ever born, and because she believed, deep down, that he needed to remember it. She signed it simply, Clara. No last name this time, just her first name, the way you speak to someone who already knows exactly who you are. She folded the letter twice, very carefully. She picked up the envelope, slid the letter inside, and held it open in her hand. She sat like that for perhaps 5 whole minutes, the envelope wide open, the porous paper exposed to the most heavily bread-scented air she had known in months. She let the air seep in. She let the scent settle into the fibers. She felt the warmth of the paper against her fingertips. Then she sealed it tight with a drop of wax. She wrote the address, and she slipped it into her bag. She didn't go to the post office that afternoon. She went on Saturday morning, bright and early before unlocking the bakery doors, with the October sun still low against the cobblestones, in one of those quiet, hushed moments before the town fully wakes up, when every single footstep echoes in a way it never does once the busy day begins. The postmistress accepted the envelope with the casual indifference of someone who handles mail every single day, and Clara silently gave thanks for that indifference. The following Tuesday, when the postman pushed open the bakery door with the day's mail, there was absolutely nothing for her. On Thursday, nothing. On Saturday, nothing. Clara baked her bread. She opened and closed the bakery. She went to the farmer's market. She drank coffee with her father. She listened to Mrs. Higgins' gossip. She sat in the pews at Sunday church. She baked Monday's bread, and she waited with that profound, specific patience of someone who knows that certain fermentations simply cannot be rushed, and that trying to force time is the absolute worst thing you can ever do to a dough that is waiting for its perfect moment to rise. Out at Maple Ridge Farm, 26 miles of winding dirt road south of Oak Creek, the day followed the rigid structure Robert Bradley had established the moment he moved back. Wake up before dawn, check the livestock, balance the ledgers, tackle the problems in the exact order they appeared, and end the day with 0 pending tasks. It was a brutally efficient structure he had developed during his grueling years working in Chicago, where chaos cost money and time was the only commodity you could never buy back. In Chicago, that structure had been a matter of survival. On the farm, it had been deeply comforting, at least in the beginning, because it filled the long hours in a way that left absolutely no room for anything else. The farm had desperately needed his labor when he finally won it back. 15 years under the hands of careless owners, followed by 2 years of total abandonment, had left deep scars that Robert had spent his first 6 months erasing with a relentless energy that the hired hands observed with quiet awe. It wasn't joyous enthusiasm, it was sheer, calculated execution. Every broken fence mended in the proper sequence, every repair weighed against its return, every single decision made with the cold logic of a man who had learned the hard way that resources are finite and that waste is a terrible insult to one's own labor. His men respected him deeply. Not a single one of them would have described him as a happy man. But none of them had ever said as much to his face. And Robert never asked, because it was exactly the kind of question he had stopped asking himself so long ago that sometimes he couldn't remember if he had deliberately stopped asking or if he had simply forgotten the answer. But there was one thing about the crushing silence of the farm that he hadn't anticipated when he was planning his triumphant return from Chicago. In the city, silence was a rare commodity, and therefore, when you finally found it, it was restful. Out on the farm, silence was the default setting, the permanent, unbroken canvas upon which everything else was painted, and inside a silence that vast, the quiet things you had taught yourself not to hear, because you were always far too busy to hear them, began to echo with a clarity that was sometimes agonizing. They were formless questions, the kind that don't demand an immediate answer, but flatly refuse to be ignored forever. They were the grown-up version of that hollow space he had recognized but refused to name. The lost, forgotten habit of actually wanting things for himself, of desiring in the purest, simplest sense of the word, the feeling of waking up in the morning and hoping to find something beautiful beyond the mere completion of the day's grueling chores. Robert had learned in Chicago that hard work was the only thing in the world that never lied. Work delivered exactly what it promised. You gave your blood and sweat, and the result appeared, proportional to your sacrifice, reliable in a way that human beings almost never were. He had built his entire return to the farm upon that exact logic, and the logic had held up perfectly. right up until the moment the farm was finally restored, the ledgers balanced, the roof repaired, the cattle grazing peacefully, and the fading afternoon brought that terrible hour when the labor ended and the silence crept in, carrying that awful question that no amount of physical work could bury anymore. Silas had come with him, his trusted foreman, 50 years old, a man of incredibly few words and endless observation, who had learned over decades of hard labor that the most vital things are rarely spoken aloud, and that sometimes the absolute best way to help a man is to simply stay out of his way. He had worked closely under Robert in Chicago for 8 years and had packed his bags immediately when Robert announced he was heading back to Pennsylvania to resurrect a ruined farm, because Silas had decided long ago that a boss you've never caught doing a single dishonest thing in 8 years of grueling work deserves your unwavering loyalty, even when he makes decisions that look entirely crazy. Maple Ridge Farm was finally back to what it once was, and in many ways it was even better. The herds were growing, the gardens thrived, the property lines were secure, the main house had been restored with sturdy, unpretentious materials. It was a highly functional farm, almost austere in its ruthless efficiency, the exact kind of place where you knew instantly what kind of man the owner was by looking at what was there, and more importantly by looking at what wasn't. What wasn't there was the warmth of a home. Silas noticed this constantly, but never said a word because it wasn't his place to speak. The large house was immaculate, perfectly organized, with everything in its designated spot. But it was the cold, sterile organization of a man who had trained himself to need practically nothing, a man trying to take up as little space as humanly possible inside his own life. Clara's letters had arrived over the past few months like a low, constant hum of interference, the kind you desperately try to tune out but can never quite escape. Robert had returned all 3 of them with a rigid consistency he internally justified as necessary, not out of cruelty, but based on a survival logic he had honed over many hard years. Never start what you cannot sustain, never open what you might not be able to close. Opening correspondence from a woman he had never invited to write him was a dangerous beginning that would inevitably lead to other beginnings. And he was living the kind of life where beginnings were a massive threat because they would force him to acknowledge the existence of a hollow space he had deliberately sworn never to look at. The 4th letter arrived on a Tuesday in late October. Silas had picked up the mail at the post office, along with the weekly supplies, just as he always did, and had left the stack on the large dining table alongside the routine invoices. Robert was reviewing the cattle ledgers when he walked past the table, blindly scooped up the pile of mail without really looking, and there it was, the envelope with the firm, unadorned handwriting he had subconsciously learned to recognize before he even read the name. The correct decision, the exact same decision he had made 3 times before, was to toss it back onto the pile to be returned during Silas's next trip into town. But before that decision could be made, before the thought could even form, before anything resembling a rational process could take place, there was the smell. It wafted up from the paper as if there was something miraculously alive trapped inside the envelope. It wasn't a slow realization. It wasn't something he had to bring it to his nose to detect. It was violent, immediate, and overwhelmingly physical. A sensation that completely bypassed the filter of his logic because it hit him before the filter could even engage. Yeast, flour. The deep, savory note of a crust that had kissed the floor of a blazing hot oven. And floating above it all, a golden sweetness that was almost impossible to describe in words, but which Robert Bradley's body recognized with a staggering force that stopped him dead in the middle of the room. He stood completely paralyzed. The invoices clutched in one hand, the letter in the other, his eyes staring blankly at the wall while something detonated inside his chest, something he hadn't felt in so many long years that he couldn't instantly recall its proper name. His mother's kitchen came rushing back first, not as a clear picture, but as a full-body sensation of a place. The specific, radiant heat of that room, the little wooden stool where he used to sit as a boy and watch her work. The red checkered tablecloth, the exact way her apron tied around her waist. His mother hadn't been a professional baker, but she had a magic touch with the oven. And there was one morning every single week, always a Thursday, when she baked bread. In the memory of that little boy, that incredible smell and those Thursday mornings were not two separate things that happened together. They were one single entity made of bread and mother and heat and safety. 4 words that deep down were really just one single word called home. Then came the bread from Hastings Bakery, different but profoundly connected. The heavy loaves arriving wrapped in brown paper every week, which his father would unwrap with that deep, reverent care Arthur Bradley reserved for fine things, as if opening the package slowly was a way of honoring the hands that made it. It was the bread of Sunday dinners. It was the bread of holiday feasts. And it was the bread that had sat quietly on the table the day his mother died, because someone from town had sent it. And Robert, 22 years old and drowning in a massive, suffocating grief that no one had ever taught him how to carry, had eaten an entire slice without even realizing it, as if his body intuitively knew it needed warmth, even while his mind was completely shattered. And then, deeper still, buried so far down it felt almost forgotten. But it wasn't forgotten, it had just been fiercely protected. An afternoon when he must have been 10 years old. His father had taken him into town because the delivery boy was sick. They had walked into the bakery, and the air was exactly flawlessly identical to the scent rising from the envelope he was holding right now. That heavy, hot, glorious air of a small-town bakery on a day of massive production. And the baker, a short man in a faded striped apron, had handed him a piece of bread straight from the fires, with butter melting into the golden crust, without even asking if he wanted it, just pressing it into his little hands, as if he knew it was absolutely necessary. And Robert had eaten that bread, with his eyes squeezed completely shut, because the warmth was so perfect, and the smell was so intensely overwhelming, that opening his eyes felt like a terrible waste. Like trying to look at a beautiful piece of music. Robert Bradley stood frozen in the middle of the parlor at Maple Ridge Farm, for a length of time he could never accurately measure later. Silas walked in through the back door, carrying the tools he had fetched from the shed, saw his boss standing there wearing an expression he had never once seen on that hardened face, and possessed the profound wisdom of a man who observes everything and knows exactly when silence is the only correct answer. Silas quietly backed out into the hallway without making a single sound. Robert tore open the envelope. It was just a few short lines. Far less than he had expected, much shorter than the previous letters probably were, though he didn't actually know, having never opened them. And that very lack of comparison was a heavy realization he filed away without knowing what to do with it yet. The handwriting was identical, firm, every single word carrying its own weight, completely lacking the flowery affectation of someone trying to impress, yet devoid of the cramped hesitation of someone trying to take up less space. He read it again. He stood there clutching the paper, the powerful scent still radiating from the creases, as if the letter held the entire roaring oven folded up inside it. There was something in that letter that obliterated his defenses in a way the first 3, no matter how honest they might have been, never could have. The first 3 were about her feelings, about her bravery in pushing forward, about the memories she wanted to hand him. This one wasn't about her at all. It was about the bread. It was about a grueling afternoon of labor and a smell she deeply loved, offered to him as the simplest, truest thing she possessed, as if saying, "I have no way to convince you of anything, but I have this, and perhaps you knew this long before you ever knew me." And there was that final sentence, which anchored itself in his chest with a precision that staggered him. She believed he needed to remember it. Not that he should remember, not that it would be nice to remember, that he needed to. As if she somehow knew, across 26 miles of winding dirt road and 4 returned envelopes, that there was a starved, hollow thing inside him, desperate for a very specific kind of memory he had stopped feeding the day he shut himself away. Robert carefully folded the letter back up. He stared down at the small paper rectangle. A fainter, softer version of the scent still drifted up from the fold. He thought of the 10-year-old boy who had eaten the hot bread with his eyes closed. He realized that the boy was still alive somewhere deep inside him, locked away in a room so heavily guarded that sometimes he seemed to not exist at all. He realized that this woman, whom he had seen for exactly 10 minutes in a crowded town square, who had written 4 times to a man who coldly rejected her 3 times, had managed to find that little boy without even knowing he was desperately searching for him. He stood perfectly still for a long time. Then he walked over to the heavy oak desk, pulled out a sheet of paper and his pen, sat down, and stared at the blank page for 10 agonizing minutes that were among the hardest minutes he had endured in recent years. Not out of pain, but out of the sheer, terrifying difficulty of starting something he had sworn never to start again, of flexing a muscle that had atrophied from years of disuse. And then he wrote. He wrote very little, because he simply didn't know how to write about himself to another human being yet, and because trying to force the words made them sound hollow and false, and he absolutely refused to be false in this letter, not after what had just arrived in that oven-scented envelope. He wrote that he had received the letter, that he had opened it, that the memory she had so vividly described was completely real, that it had truly happened exactly like that there had been a baker in a striped apron and a piece of bread that had been the greatest thing he had ever tasted in his life up to that moment. He wrote that he had carried that exact smell with him for a very long time afterward, the way certain smells embed themselves in your soul without asking permission, hiding there until the day they suddenly rush back to find you. And finally, he wrote one last sentence, a sentence that cost him vastly more effort than all the others combined, his pen hovering motionlessly over the paper for a long moment before pressing down. He wrote that he sincerely apologized for returning the previous letters, that it had never been out of rudeness, it had been out of sheer fear. And that fear was a miserable excuse, but it was the only honest truth he had to offer her. He signed it. Robert. He folded it, slipped it into an envelope, walked out to find Silas, and quietly asked him to take it to the post office first thing the next morning, along with the weekly supply list. Silas took the envelope. He didn't say a word, because absolutely nothing needed to be said. But in the careful way, he held it with that specific, gentle reverence reserved for carrying something vastly more important than it appears. There was the silent, profound recognition of a man who had been waiting for that exact envelope for much longer than his boss ever knew. Robert's reply arrived on a Thursday morning. Clara was elbow-deep in the oven, checking the baking stones, when Tommy scurried in with the day's mail. The young boy had quickly learned over the past months that letters for Clara must be delivered directly into her hands and never just tossed onto the counter, especially the ones bearing a certain farm's return address that he had come to recognize. He walked right up to the oven, waited patiently for her to turn around, and handed her the envelope. Clara just looked at it. It was completely different from the ones she had been sending. It was larger, the paper much thicker, the handwriting completely different from hers, but possessing a quality she instantly recognized as kindred, the script of someone who had learned to write with the exact same philosophy her father had taught her. Every letter carrying its own weight, every single word exactly where it belonged. She slid the envelope deep into the pocket of her apron. She finished her work with the ovens. She pulled the hot tins out, carefully turned the golden loaves onto the cooling racks, and checked the ambient temperature for the next massive batch. Every single movement retained its usual flawless precision, but there was an undeniable buoyant lightness in her hands that morning, a bright quality of attention that Tommy, who had learned to read Clara's moods entirely by the way she moved around the kitchen, noticed immediately, even if he couldn't put a name to it. It was only much later, after the bakery had opened, after the morning rush of customers had faded, with the counter wiped clean and the afternoon loaves quietly resting, that Clara untied her apron, washed her hands meticulously, retreated to the quiet back hallway, and finally tore open the envelope. She read it very slowly. She read it again. She sat holding the heavy paper for an unmeasured amount of time, resting on the wooden bench in the hallway, while the weak light from the high, narrow window cast a slanted rectangle on the brick floor. A rectangle she had looked at her entire life without ever really seeing. There were muffled voices out front, Tommy serving a customer with a newfound confidence he had grown into lately, the familiar jingle of the shop door opening and closing, the comforting, rhythmic heartbeat of the bakery marching on. There was something in that letter she hadn't anticipated, not in the specific words he used, but in the raw, unpolished quality of what was written. It was the letter of a proud man who had stopped speaking about himself years ago, who was attempting to use a rusted muscle, and because of that very struggle, every single sentence had cost him dearly, and the paper practically hummed with the weight of that cost. There was no artifice, no pretty framing, no desperate attempt to sound a certain way. There was only exactly what there was. The very last sentence settled into her bones with a staggering clarity. It hadn't been rudeness, it had been fear. And fear was a miserable excuse, but it was the truth. Clara folded the letter with immense care. She held it gently between her fingertips for a long moment, feeling the rich texture of the paper, that heavy, deliberate quality, proving it had been chosen with real attention, or at the very least, not chosen thoughtlessly. And then she suddenly realized she was smiling. Not a wide, beaming smile, not the kind people put on for photographs. It was the quiet, profound smile that only appears when something is finally perfectly right. The letters that followed were entirely different. They became a steady rhythm, spaced out by 2 weeks at first, then shrinking to a week, then twice a week. There was something almost comical about their timing. On Tuesdays, both letters would invariably arrive at their respective destinations at the exact same time. Hers mailed the previous Friday, and his mailed on Monday, passing each other somewhere along that dusty 26-mile road between the town and the farm, like the exact same thoughts traveling in opposite, complementary directions. She would open his letter and discover that she had unknowingly answered exactly what he had asked her the week before, as if they were carrying on the exact same conversation in parallel without ever planning it. Robert wrote about the farm with the blunt precision that defined him, but his sentences slowly grew longer as the weeks passed, showing a willingness to linger on a thought just a bit longer than strictly necessary, as if the act of writing itself were physical therapy for a soul that had been locked up too long. He wrote about the cattle, about the new peach orchard he had planted, where an older one had succumbed to the years of neglect, about a torrential rain that had lasted days longer than it should have, and the brutal dry spell that followed. There was a grounded reality in his descriptions that Clara deeply loved. These weren't fluffy letters full of vague romance. They were solid letters about real dirt and real work that accidentally revealed profound emotions hiding in the cracks. In a letter arriving in mid-November, Robert wrote about a specific moment at dusk. He had just finished inspecting the barbed wire on the north pasture, and it was that magical hour of the evening when the light across the Pennsylvania hills takes on a color that doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, a fiery orange that bleeds into crimson right before the dark swallows it. And he had stopped, leaning heavily against the wooden fence post, just staring at it. He wrote that he stood there for perhaps 10 whole minutes doing absolutely nothing, just watching the sky burn, and he suddenly realized he hadn't done that in years. He realized he had completely lost the habit of stopping to look at things that possessed no immediate practical use. He wrote that he had tried to pinpoint exactly when he lost that habit, but couldn't find the exact day, which meant the loss had been slow and gradual enough to slip by unnoticed. He wrote that he had thought of her in that exact moment. That he had thought she was probably the kind of woman who always stopped to look at things with no practical use, because that was simply the kind of soul she was, and that he had found something deeply comforting in thinking about her while watching that impossible orange turn to red. Clara read that paragraph 3 times. The vivid image of Robert Bradley leaning against a weathered fence, completely alone, finally stopping to watch the sun go down after years of refusing to see anything at all, was one of the most painfully honest things another human being had ever given her in writing. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, it was a quiet admission. And quiet admissions cost vastly more than grand declarations, because you can rehearse a declaration, but an admission slips out when the armor finally drops without warning. She wrote back telling him that she had stopped to look at things her entire life, ever since she was a little girl sitting on the bench out front, waiting for the dough to rise, and that she had learned early on that true, lasting growth only happens when no one is trying to force it. That the bread always knows when it's being rushed, that the fields probably know it too, and that people almost certainly know it as well. Robert didn't answer that specific part of her letter directly, but the following week he wrote a single line she immediately understood as his reply. He wrote that he had leaned against that exact same fence post for a lot longer that evening, and the orange had been even more impossible. He finally wrote about his father in a late November letter, dancing around the edges of the topic at first, before diving straight in. The devastating loss of the farm, the sudden scattering of the family, the brutal reality of fleeing to Chicago with empty pockets, and a grim determination that he now, looking back, recognized as the only shield he had left at the time. He wrote that he had hauled bricks on construction sites for years, fueled by the frantic energy of a man terrified to look anywhere but straight ahead, and that while that relentless drive had successfully built his fortune, it had also forged a man who was terrifyingly accustomed to never stopping. He wrote that he had marched back to the farm truly believing that closing that painful circle would be enough, and that he had been completely blindsided when it wasn't. He didn't explicitly name the hollow space waiting inside that closed circle. Clara didn't push him to name it yet. She simply wrote back that she understood completely, that she had learned from watching her own father that a thriving bakery didn't automatically equal a full life, and that there was a massive difference between keeping busy and being truly present, a difference that hides well when you're buried in chores, but reveals itself with agonizing clarity the moment the day's labor is done and the silence sets in. She wrote about Oliver with the fierce, direct affection she reserved for the things she truly loved. Those quiet mornings when he appeared on the bench with his coffee waiting, his endless critiques of the crust that continued to this day, the pure, solitary joy of pulling a flawless batch from the fire. A joy that requires absolutely no audience because it is whole, all on its own. She wrote about Mrs. Higgins with a hilarious mix of fond exasperation, describing the seamstress as simultaneously the most irritating and the most endearing human being in all of Oak Creek, a total contradiction that somehow existed in perfect harmony. She wrote about the freezing early mornings alone with the roaring oven, the soft dough, and a profound silence that was entirely different from any other silence in the day. In a letter sent in early December, she wrote, almost without realizing her pen was moving, that there were days when she woke up at 4 in the morning and lay there thinking about him before she went down to light the fires. She reread the sentence after she finished it, Her pen hovered over the paper for a long minute. Then she carefully folded the letter and sealed it with wax, without crossing out a single word. Robert's reply to that letter was the longest he had ever written. He said he had read that one sentence 3 times, that he had carried it around in his pocket for 2 whole days, taking it with him back and forth from the house to the barns, in those brief moments of rest between chores. He wrote that he didn't know how to reply without sounding like someone else, but that it would be a lie not to confess that it had been happening to him too, that he had been waking up early and thinking of her with a stubborn regularity that he had tried to fight off for a while, until fighting it became significantly more exhausting than simply admitting that it was what it was. What exactly it was, he didn't say in that letter. But the very next week, he wrote to ask if she would be at the bakery on Saturday afternoon. She replied yes, that she would always be there. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon. Clara was just finishing wiping down the shelves after locking the front door, the leftover loaves perfectly aligned, the wooden counter gleaming, the bakery wrapped in that specific, heavy quiet that descends on busy places the moment the crowd finally leaves, when she heard the sharp knock on the glass. It was a very distinct knock, neither timid nor impatient, the firm knock of a man who had made his decision before he ever walked up the steps, and who was now executing that decision. She knew exactly who it was. And yet, she still felt the air shift in her lungs when she unlocked the door. Robert Bradley, without his hat, was entirely different from Robert Bradley with his hat. Without the fedora, she could clearly see his dark brown hair, dusted with the first silver marks of grey at his temples, which matched the age in his eyes, that honest, bone-deep weariness that the decades carve into men who have truly lived them. He wore a crisp, light shirt, having left his heavy coat behind on this mild Saturday, making the broad span of his shoulders, which she had noticed way back at the market, seem even more imposing. His hands rested loosely in front of him, carrying a controlled stillness that was the only outward clue the man was incredibly nervous, because his face was locked into that familiar, guarded containment she had learned to read through months of letters as his default mask, the face he wore while he was still figuring out the terrain. He said, "Good afternoon." His voice was lower and much more direct than she had imagined, though truthfully she had stopped trying to imagine it weeks ago and had simply waited to hear it. She said good afternoon back and pulled the door open wider. He stepped inside the bakery. He froze the second he crossed the threshold, and Clara watched it happen to him exactly as she had hoped it would. The smell. Not the faint ghost of a scent clinging to paper, not a distant memory trapped inside a folded letter, but the massive, overpowering, living reality of a room where bread had been born every single day for over 30 years. The aroma was permanently fused into the thick stone walls, baked into the heavy ceiling beams, rubbed into the scarred wood of the counter, hanging suspended in the air even hours after the doors were shut. Robert stood completely paralyzed, and the tightly controlled mask shattered, replaced by something much softer, far more open, the vulnerable expression of a man who had not prepared himself to be hit by that force with such staggering intensity, and who was completely disarmed. They stood in absolute silence for a long moment, a silence that demanded zero apologies for existing. Then, his voice barely a murmur, he said it was exactly how he remembered it. And Clara understood, with the profound clarity of things you feel in your soul long before you think them, that he wasn't just talking about the bakery. They sat and talked for almost 2 hours. Clara poured him a cup of coffee, brewing it much stronger than she normally would, realizing she had done so instinctively, and set out a platter of the finest cheddar rolls left over from the afternoon bake. They sat on opposite sides of the worn wooden counter with the remarkable ease of 2 people who had spent months rigorously practicing this exact conversation on paper, arriving at this first physical meeting with a deep intimacy that first dates almost never possess. They spoke about their letters indirectly at first, circling back to things they had written like two travelers revisiting a familiar road, but seeing it from a brand new angle. Robert confessed that he frequently reread hers. Clara admitted she had saved every single one of his. He went completely quiet at that, absorbing the heavy implication of that tiny detail, and then murmured that he hadn't thrown hers away either. She smiled softly and said she knew. He looked up, surprised, and asked how she could possibly know that. She told him that people who throw things away don't return them. Only a man who hasn't made up his mind yet bothers to return them. He stared at her with an intensity that was vastly different from that 3-second look at the market. He told her she was even more direct in person than he had imagined. She replied that he had read enough of her letters to know exactly what to expect. He nodded slowly, and the very beginning of something tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a full smile, but infinitely more than he had allowed himself to show her so far. They talked about the farm. He described his endless repairs with the blunt precision of a man who knows his own labor intimately and refuses to dress it up in flowery words to make it matter. She peppered him with questions about the cattle, the quality of the grazing pastures, the reliability of the well water in the dead of winter. He looked genuinely taken aback by the questions. They were the exact piercing questions of someone who actually understood the grueling reality of farm life. She explained that she had grown up in a town that kept the surrounding farms alive, and that she had absorbed a great deal of agricultural wisdom simply by osmosis since childhood. He asked about Oliver. She spoke of her father's illness with the calm honesty of someone who refuses to inject more drama into a tragedy than the situation inherently holds, about their quiet mornings sitting on the bench out front, about her mother's black notebook of recipes that had magically resurfaced just a few months ago. Robert listened with an attention she recognized instantly as entirely genuine, not the polite, feigned attention of someone just waiting for their turn to speak, but the deep, anchoring attention of a man receiving something precious with absolute care because he understands the profound value of what is being offered. He said he remembered Oliver well. He said the baker was a man with a very specific, towering presence, that unshakable tranquility that only exists in a man who has achieved absolute mastery over his craft. She smiled and agreed, adding that the longest, hardest realization of her entire life had been discovering that her father didn't actually know everything, that there were things Oliver navigated purely by blind intuition, exactly the same way she navigated the fires of her ovens, lacking absolute certainty, relying only on having enough years of failure to finally trust what his hands were telling him. She said that the day she finally accepted his flaws, she had somehow felt vastly closer to him than ever before, as if their shared human imperfection forged a kind of deep intimacy that blind, awe-struck admiration could never allow. Robert stared down into the dark depths of his coffee cup for a long moment. The sunlight streaming through the front window had completely shifted its tone since he arrived, the bright gold of the afternoon surrendering to the softer, bruised amber of the dying day, and a heavy, pregnant silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, but thick with gravity, the kind of silence that falls heavily when a conversation edges incredibly close to something that hasn't been said out loud yet. Then he spoke, using the low, raspy voice she had come to recognize as the voice he only used for things that hurt to say. He said he had spent the last few weeks thinking obsessively about what he had written to her, about that empty space waiting inside the closed circle of his life. He said he had finally reached a conclusion that was incredibly simple, yet had taken him a lifetime to figure out, that the empty space was simply his lost habit of wanting things for himself. That he had spent so many long, brutal years wanting the farm back, and then finally having the farm back, that he had entirely forgotten there were other categories of wanting in this world, besides the ones that fit neatly into a 15-year business plan. Clara said absolutely nothing. She just waited. He looked up at her and said he had woken up thinking about her on many, many mornings, and that there was no pending chore, no business decision to make, no practical, logical reason in the world to justify the thought. The bakery was dead silent. Outside, Oak Creek went about its evening rituals, the distant toll of the church bell, muffled voices heading home, a heavy wagon rolling slowly down the adjacent street with the plodding, steady rhythm that was the heartbeat of that world. The light from the window had turned into that thick, molten gold of the setting sun that in October made everything it touched look like a warmer, richer version of itself. Clara stared at Robert Bradley across the battered wooden counter and felt, with that absolute, undeniable clarity of things that finally arrive and that you recognize instantly before you even have words for them, the sheer weight of the standard she had fiercely guarded for so many years. The feeling that makes you wake up at 4 in the morning, thinking about someone without meaning to, without reason, without any justification other than pure desire. She had woken up thinking about him more times than she could ever count. She looked at him and said she knew. She said she had known for a while. He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. On his third visit, they stayed talking much later than the other times, the bakery completely dark, except for the single oil lamp Clara had lit when the sun finally dipped below the hills. Their conversation waded deeper into the waters their letters had only waded in, the words carrying a completely different, heavier weight when spoken aloud, with the actual person sitting just a few feet away across the wood. Robert spoke about Chicago in a way he had only ever hinted at in ink. The terrifying first months of near starvation, the bruised, bleeding pride of a country boy who had grown up on hundreds of acres now hauling heavy bricks on another man's construction site, the agonizingly slow transformation from a lowly day laborer into a successful contractor that had cost him 7 years of backbreaking work without a single day of rest. He told her those years had taught him brutal lessons he had never asked to learn, and that the one that had scarred him the deepest was this. You can build absolutely anything in this world if you break your back hard enough, but building a house is not the same thing as knowing how to live inside it. That's standing inside a fortress you bled to build, but having no idea how to actually exist inside it leaves a bitter, confusing taste in your mouth that takes a very long time to identify. Clara absorbed every word with that profound, anchoring attention she reserved for the things that truly mattered, the kind of listening that doesn't rush, doesn't interrupt, and gives the pain all the air it needs to breathe. When he finally stopped speaking, she sat in the dim lamplight for a long time before replying. Then she gently repeated something her father had told her years ago during a long night by the fires, that every perfect loaf of bread carries the invisible history of the hands that shaped it, that you simply cannot separate the final product from the grueling journey, and that whatever pain or joy the baker has endured gets kneaded directly into the dough in a way that can never, ever be baked out. Robert fell completely silent at that, and there was something in his silence that she recognized instantly as the absolute stillness of a man who has just been handed a profound truth that landed right in a place he hadn't prepared for visitors. He softly asked if she would come out to see the farm the following Sunday. It wasn't a flowery, elaborate invitation. It was blunt, direct, practically devoid of framing, exactly the way he handled the things that mattered most, without any pretty decorations, because decorations would only draw attention to how much the question terrified him, and he was still learning that letting someone see your fear wasn't actually weakness at all. She smiled and said yes. That Sunday was bitterly cold with the crisp, biting chill of late October. The sky a brilliant, washed-out blue that only appears after a heavy rain scrubs the world clean. The sun shining brightly, but offering warmth without burning. The dirt road from town out to Maple Ridge Farm was 26 miles long, a journey the rented buggy covered in a little over an hour, and Clara sat upright on the leather seat with her hands folded in her lap. The sharp country air rushing through the open windows, carrying that intoxicating blend of damp earth, sweet hay, and mountain pine that she had breathed her entire life and which never failed to settle her soul. There was something profoundly unique about the Pennsylvania countryside on that specific kind of freezing, crystal-clear morning that she had always found difficult to put into words but recognized immediately. It was the distinct sensation that the world was incredibly awake, far more alert than on lazy summer days. The biting cold seemed to sharpen the edges of the world, making the colors pop and the distant sounds echo with startling clarity. The little farmhouses they passed, the weathered barns, the sagging, rusted barbed wire fences with posts leaning from decades of wind, everything possessed a hyper-realistic detail that only a clean frost can create. Silas met her at the front gate with practiced courtesy, tipping his hat with the exact level of respect he reserved for his boss's private affairs, and immediately vanished toward the barns with a purposeful speed that Clara found deeply diplomatic. Robert strode down the main dirt path with those heavy, grounded steps of a man walking on dirt he owns, and there was something fundamentally different about him out here on his own land. A strange, unfamiliar lightness that the town never brought out in him, as if the farm were the one place on earth where he didn't feel the crushing need to hold up the sky. They walked for hours through the rolling pastures, through the rows of young peach trees he had planted his very first year back, trees that were still small but already possessed the stubborn, deeply rooted stance of things determined to survive. They walked past the cattle grazing in the morning sun and through the massive vegetable garden where the impossibly straight rows revealed the exact same ruthless, methodical mind that governed everything Robert touched. He explained the workings of the farm with the blunt, factual precision she had grown to love in his letters, and she asked questions with the sharp, focused attention of someone who genuinely cared, completely stripping away the polite fluff of small talk. Eventually, they stopped near a small, glassy pond at the very back edge of the property, where an ancient, massive weeping willow had somehow survived everything the cruel years had thrown at the farm. It stood there, gnarled and incredibly thick, radiating that specific stubborn permanence of ancient trees that have seen empires fall and simply decided to stay rooted anyway. Robert looked up at the sprawling branches and quietly said that the willow had been there since before his grandfather was born, that it was the only living thing on the entire property that had remained completely unchanged during all those bitter years the farm was out of the family's hands. He said this and then fell silent, a silence that clearly meant the tree held a weight he was never going to attempt to force into a sentence, and Clara didn't ask him to try. They stood side by side, staring out over the still water for a long time, listening to the low, constant hum of the autumn crickets that persist even in the freezing cold, standing beneath the ancient willow whose thick roots grabbed the dark earth like knuckles. And inside that moment, inside that quiet pause with absolutely no practical purpose, she felt exactly what she had described to him in her letter months ago about the lost habit of stopping to just look at things. They were mutually acknowledging that they were doing exactly that, together, without either of them needing to ruin it by saying it out loud. The main house possessed that unshakable, functional solidity that was his absolute trademark. Every single object in its logical place. Everything necessary was there. And absolutely nothing unnecessary was tolerated. It was spotless, organized, flawlessly maintained. And clinging to the walls, which she noticed discreetly but immediately, was that haunting absence of warmth that Silas had recognized months ago. Not an absence of physical comfort, but an absence of a soul. It was the screaming silence of a house where a man sleeps every night, but where no one actually lives. But when she stepped into the kitchen, she stopped dead in her tracks. She stood frozen, staring intensely at the massive cast-iron stove with the highly critical eye of a woman who understands fire, mentally measuring the layout, the angle of the stove in relation to the back window, the flow of the workspace around it. Robert caught her staring, a look he recognized perfectly well after reading months of letters detailing exactly how deeply she understood ovens, and asked her what was wrong. She looked at him and said the stove was magnificent, but it was facing the wrong way. She explained that where it sat, whoever was cooking had their back turned completely to the backyard window, and that a truly good kitchen requires light, that the person baking needs to be able to look outside while their hands are working, that there is an actual, undeniable difference between a loaf of bread baked in a kitchen full of natural sunlight and a loaf baked staring at a dark wall, and that while she couldn't explain the science behind it, she knew it as an absolute, undeniable fact. Robert stared at the heavy iron stove with the bewildered expression of a man who had never once considered such a thing in his entire life, but who was thinking about it very seriously now. Then he nodded slowly and said she was absolutely right. She smiled and told him it was an easy fix. He just needed to drag the heavy iron frame a few feet to the left. He nodded again and said he knew. They fell into a heavy silence in the middle of the spotless kitchen, the weak sunlight from the yard hitting the floor at the completely wrong angle, highlighting the exact flaw she had just pointed out. And then Robert turned to her, his voice dropping low, and said there was something he desperately needed to tell her, something he had been carrying around since the very first day he walked into her bakery, something that ink and paper simply couldn't hold because it was the kind of truth that required a voice and a living person standing right in front of him. Clara simply waited. He looked her dead in the eye and said he had spent years ruthlessly convincing himself that the only way to be safe in this world was to never, ever want anything that could be taken away. He said he had built an entire empire on that exact logic, and that it had kept him alive for a very long time because it gave him a singular focus, and because the agony of living like a machine was far less than the agony he knew would come if he ever let his guard down. But there was one thing, he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, that had kept breaking through the cracks over the last few months, completely defying his flawless logic. It tore through his defenses every single time an envelope arrived, bearing her firm handwriting. It shattered him completely when the smell of baking bread stopped him dead in his tracks on a random Tuesday and dragged him backward through decades in a split second. He took a slow breath and said it was a terribly simple thing to say out loud, but it had nearly killed him to admit it to himself. He didn't want to send anything back ever again. Clara looked up into his weathered face for a long moment. There were so many ways to answer a confession like that. There was the deeply romantic way, the strictly practical way, the guarded, cautious way. She chose the exact way her father had taught her to handle the bread, which was the most ruthlessly honest way she knew, that when you have the perfect recipe and the oven is hot and the timing is right, you don't need to do much of anything except step back and let it rise. She looked at him and said softly that he didn't ever have to send anything back again. He froze, standing perfectly still for a second that stretched out into an eternity. And then he took one step forward, and she took a half step to meet him, and when their hands finally found each other for the very first time, they gripped with the desperate, unshakable firmness of two people who had already practiced this exact moment in thousands of written words, for long enough to know exactly what it was when it finally arrived, never mistaking it for anything else, requiring no further proof that this was exactly where they were meant to be. Across the yard, standing safely out of sight by the barn, Silas pretended to be incredibly focused on mending a leather strap that absolutely did not need mending. But that afternoon, the quiet foreman brewed the coffee significantly hotter than he had in months, stirred in 2 extra spoonfuls of sugar because he knew the boss needed sweetness, and arranged the ceramic cups on the tin tray with a tender care that was entirely absent from his usual gruff afternoon routine. If your heart is feeling a little warmer right now, please tell me in the comments exactly what you're feeling, all right? Write down what you think is going to happen next, or what this story brings to mind for you. And now, we reach the end. 2 years later, in the biting cold of November 1936, the kitchen of the main house at Maple Ridge Farm had a massive iron stove that directly faced the beautiful backyard window. The grueling work had been done on a Saturday in early March, with Robert hauling the crushing weight of the cast iron with that terrifying, calm strength of a man executing a decision he has made in his very soul, while Clara orchestrated the new angle with the absolute precision of a woman who had spent her entire life studying exactly how sunlight needs to hit the places where bread is born. Silas had watched the sweaty ordeal from the doorway with the mildly resigned expression of a man who privately thought the whole operation was a massive waste of labor, but who wisely acknowledged that it wasn't his kitchen, and that there are things in this world vastly more important than mere efficiency. The large window looked out over the sprawling orchard of peach trees Robert had planted his first year back, and by November of 1936, those trees had 2 more solid years of growth in them. They had borne fruit for the second time, the peaches still small but undeniably present, clinging fiercely to the branches with that beautiful, silent promise inherent in things that take a very long time to ripen, but which absolutely, inevitably will. Oliver Hastings had taken the buggy out to visit the farm exactly twice in those 2 years. On his second visit, he had spent the entire afternoon sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch with Robert, and when Clara finally came out to call them in for dinner, she found the 2 men sitting in complete silence, but it was the rich, comfortable silence that only exists between men who have already said the few things that matter and are perfectly content with where they stand. On the buggy ride back to Oak Creek, Oliver had looked at his daughter with the quiet, devastating wisdom of a man who had been reading people from behind a bakery counter since he was 27, and told her that Robert Bradley was the rare kind of man who actually listens, and that this trait was vastly rarer and vastly more important than most people would ever realize. Hastings Bakery still stood proud on Main Street. Clara still woke up at 4 in the morning on most days, her body faithfully obeying a rhythm carved into her bones over decades. But there were many Saturdays when she woke up out at the farm, and on those cold mornings, the bedroom was filled with a completely different soundtrack than the solitary silence of the bakery. It was the sound of the vast countryside slowly waking up, the wild birds that use the peach orchard as their morning gathering ground, the low bellow of cattle far off in the pastures, the gruff shout of Silas echoing from the barns with the terrifying regularity of a man who didn't need a pocket watch to know the exact minute the sun broke the horizon. And there was the rich, dark smell of black coffee that Robert brewed in the kitchen, while she was still tangled in the heavy quilts, a smell that drifted down the long hallway like a gentle, unspoken promise that the new day had officially begun, and that there was a warm fire waiting for her outside the blankets. She had discovered, over those 2 incredible years, that there was actually one scent on earth capable of competing with the smell of bread fresh from the oven. It didn't replace it. It stood right beside it as an equal, 2 magnificent forces belonging to the exact same world, completing each other perfectly. Robert's morning coffee brewing on that heavy iron stove, now perfectly aligned with the window, catching the slanted morning light through the peach trees, had the exact same magical effect on her soul that the roaring ovens of the bakery had possessed her entire life. It told her that the day had started. It told her there was a reason to get out of bed. It told her there was something incredibly good waiting for her just outside the door. On a freezing morning in November 1936, Clara's eyes snapped open at 4 o'clock out of sheer habit. She lay perfectly still in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the sprawling farm wrapped in that profound, heavy silence that exists just before dawn. A silence that isn't empty, but vibrating with things that haven't quite started yet. She heard the faint rustle of Robert waking up, moving with the agonizing care of a massive man, desperately trying not to wake the woman sleeping beside him. She heard his heavy footsteps padding softly down the stairs, possessing that surprising, ghostly lightness that big men learn when they realize they don't need to make noise to prove they exist. She heard him walk into the kitchen. She heard the familiar, comforting squeak of the heavy iron stove door being pulled open. He was lighting the fire. She lay there staring into the shadows for a very long time, wearing a soft, completely unguarded smile that no one in the world was watching, and which, because of that very secrecy, was entirely free to be exactly what it was. When she finally wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and padded down to the kitchen, Robert had his back to the hallway, standing squarely in front of the window that was just beginning to frame the pale, icy blue of the breaking dawn above the orchard. The young peach trees were stark black silhouettes against the freezing sky. A heavy ceramic bowl full of flour sat waiting on the wooden counter, and sitting right beside it was a brand new notebook. Not her father's, not her mother's, but a blank one she had bought and begun filling out here on the farm, tracking her wild new recipes, meticulously logging the adjustments in temperature, resting times, and yeast behavior that were her private way of making sense of the world. Robert turned around the second he heard her soft footsteps on the floorboards, and he wore that specific expression on his face, the one she had learned was the truest, rawest look he was capable of showing. It wasn't the iron mask he wore to town when he needed to be the intimidating boss, but the entirely exposed face of a man completely anchored to where he stood. Totally stripped of the exhausting paranoia of someone expecting disaster to strike at any second. It was the face of a man who had slowly, agonizingly learned that the best things aren't always snatched away. A man who had arrived at this terrifying conclusion not because someone promised him he was safe, but through the undeniable daily proof of 2 years of a love that simply proved over and over that it was absolutely there to stay. Clara froze in the doorway for a second, breathing in the sharp, metallic tang of the heating iron, the dry, dusty scent of the flour waiting in the bowl, the crisp bite of the morning air slipping through the window frames alongside the pale blue light. She stood there thinking that there was an incredible story that 4 desperate letters had started, and which was still being written every single day, not with ink on paper, but in the most permanent, indestructible language she knew, the shared, quiet habits of 2 completely separate lives that had melted into one. It was written in the kitchen with the perfectly placed window, in the hot coffee waiting before dawn, as a tiny daily declaration that someone had thought of the other before they thought of anything else. She stepped into the warm kitchen. She brushed her hand gently against Robert's arm as she walked past him, a fleeting, entirely dramatic-free gesture that was the secret language of their lives, a language that required 0 translation, because it had been painstakingly built over hundreds of early mornings, thousands of cups of coffee, endless batches of bread, and quiet conversations about absolutely nothing that somehow contained absolutely everything that mattered. She walked over to the iron hook by the sink and pulled down her apron, the faded blue-striped apron that was the absolute only piece of the town bakery she had brought across 26 miles of dirt road. The apron that smelled fiercely of living yeast even right after it was washed, because it was the kind of fabric that absorbed the history of everything it had survived. She tied the strings around her waist. Robert casually shifted his weight, stepping slightly to the left to give her the perfect amount of space at the counter without her having to ask, the completely automatic reflex of a man who had memorized the exact rhythm of the woman beside him without even realizing he was studying it. The very first blinding ray of actual sunlight broke over the horizon, piercing the window and striking the flour in the heavy bowl, turning the white dust into pure, shimmering gold for one breathtaking second before the morning settled in and the world returned to exactly what it was meant to be. A warm kitchen, a cold morning, 2 people, and a fire burning at the exact right temperature. There was bread to be made, and there was an entire, beautiful morning waiting right in front of them. There was something profound about that specific November morning in 1936 that Clara would only fully understand much later, when she tried to explain the feeling to herself and found that her vast vocabulary fell entirely short, which was incredibly rare for a woman who had spent 2 years finding the exact perfect words to write in letters. The truth was simply this: it was the most spectacularly ordinary morning she had ever lived in that house. Absolutely nothing special happened. No massive decisions were made. No earth-shattering revelations fell from the sky that hadn't already fallen a dozen times before. It was just a cold morning spent baking bread in a kitchen with the perfect window, standing next to a giant of a man who moved out of her way without being asked because he knew exactly how much space she needed to breathe, and the fact that it was so staggeringly ordinary was the absolute proof of everything. Because the truly extraordinary miracles happen only once in a lifetime, and they are extraordinary precisely because they are so rare. But the wonderfully ordinary things that make life beautiful happen every single day, and they are the true, honest measure of exactly how far you have come. Clara had learned this profound truth from the dough long before she learned it from life. That the most beautiful loaf of bread you ever bake isn't the one for the grand festival, or the holiday feast, or the day you have a massive audience and want to show off your brilliant skills. The most beautiful loaf is the one you pull from the fire on a random, exhausting Tuesday, doing the exact same motions with the exact same tired hands, paying the exact same quiet attention, and the bread comes out flawless, not because there's any special reason for it to, but simply because that is how it always comes out when your life is perfectly aligned. The random Tuesday proves what you have built in the dark. The festival just proves what you are capable of showing off. The Tuesday proves who you actually are. And that freezing morning in November was the random Tuesday of everything they had fought for since October 1934. The recipe Clara was testing that morning belonged entirely to the new notebook. It wasn't Oliver's genius, and it wasn't Teresa's legacy. It was hers. She had started filling those blank pages 3 months after she began spending her weekends at the farm, when she quickly realized that the elevation of the ridge, just slightly higher and colder than the valley of Oak Creek, was altering the wild yeast's behavior in ways she felt in the sticky dough long before she saw it in the final crust. It was a tiny, microscopic adjustment of water, flour, and resting time, but it was the exact kind of adjustment that meant the difference between a loaf that was merely good and a loaf that belonged perfectly, undeniably, to that specific piece of earth. And inside that tiny adjustment, she had discovered a truth far bigger than baking. She learned that every single place on earth has a bread that belongs to it, a bread born from the unique moisture of that soil. The chill of that specific air, the exact altitude, and the unique mineral bite of the well water. And the true job of a baker who moves to a new home isn't to stubbornly force the old bread to survive in the new dirt, but to listen closely and discover what the new bread actually is. You don't replace, you discover. They are 2 entirely different actions that create 2 completely different lives. Robert had watched this obsessive testing process with that intense, silent observation he reserved for things he knew were monumental, but didn't have the vocabulary for yet. He had asked piercing questions. The kind of questions that proved he had been paying rigorous attention for weeks before he opened his mouth. He asked about the origin of the wild yeast, about the brutal thermal differences between his cast-iron stove and her massive brick ovens in town. About exactly why the crumb of the bread changed its entire structure just because they were a few 100 feet higher in the hills. They were the brilliant questions of an engineer, a man who understood complex systems, a man who had learned from years of hauling bricks and breeding cattle that absolutely nothing exists in isolation, that everything bleeds into everything else, and that survival depends entirely on understanding those invisible connections. Clara had loved those questions far more than she ever thought possible. There is a very specific, intoxicating magic in having the person you love ask you brilliant questions about the work that defines your soul. It is entirely different from hollow praise, which anyone can offer without understanding a thing, and entirely different from polite curiosity, which just asks questions to fill the silence. It is the ultimate form of respect, acknowledging that the quiet thing you do with your hands holds a universe of depth worth exploring. She would answer, and Robert would listen, and then he would ask something deeper, and there had been one rainy afternoon where they sat at that kitchen table for 3 straight hours, talking about nothing in the world but yeast, and at the end of those 3 hours, they both realized something profound about themselves that they hadn't known before. They were the rare kind of people who could talk about one single boring topic for 3 hours without either of them wishing they were anywhere else on earth. It is a specific, unbreakable kind of compatibility that never shows up on a first date and absolutely cannot be faked. The shared obsession with the tiny details, the love of the deep mechanics of simple things, the thrilling willingness to dive headfirst into the profound depths of something that the rest of the world dismisses as completely ordinary. A month ago, Oliver had sent Tommy out to the farm with a frantic message demanding Clara come back to town on a specific Tuesday because he had found something she needed to see immediately. When she rushed into the bakery, her father was sitting at the table, the old black notebook flipped open to a page she had never seen before. A page filled with a tiny, slanted, elegant handwriting she instantly recognized from the single surviving letter her mother had left behind. It was Teresa's recipe for a dark, heavily spiced molasses bread she used to bake when the snowstorms hit, a recipe Oliver swore he had hunted for desperately for years, having hidden the book so safely in his grief that it had taken him 13 years to finally dig it out again. They spent the entire morning huddled together trying to decode the tiny, faded handwriting, guessing at archaic abbreviations, Oliver reading the faded ink aloud while Clara copied the translations into her new notebook. And the air that morning had a golden, suspended quality that Clara later tried to explain to Robert as the kind of sacred moment you don't even realize you're standing inside until you walk out of it and realize your entire soul has shifted. When she packed her bags to head back to the farm that afternoon, Oliver had walked her out to the front door, standing proudly by his weathered wooden bench, and told her something she carried with her all the way home. He told her that Teresa had baked that dark molasses loaf exactly 1 week before she fell fatally ill, and that he hadn't kept the recipe all these years because he wanted to bake it again, but because he was terrified of losing the physical stroke of her pen, the actual surviving movement of a hand he had loved with all his heart, a hand that had vanished from the earth when she was still so painfully young. He said he could always figure out how to bake the bread from memory, and it would probably taste fine, though the hands making it always alter the soul of the dough. But the actual recipe, the physical paper, was the only place where her spirit still moved. And that handwriting was a powerful ghost that time could never, ever erase. Clara had clutched that story tightly in her chest during the long, buggy ride back to the farm, bouncing over the rutted dirt road while the autumn fields blurred past the window. She thought of her 4 desperate letters, She thought about the beautiful, haunting idea that a person's handwriting is a living presence, and realized it wasn't so different from the idea that a smell is a living presence. They were both desperate, brilliant tricks the human senses invent to hold on to the things that death tries to steal. Tiny, physical archives of the things that kept us alive. She thought about her stubborn father hiding a recipe for 13 years because the grief was too heavy, and how calling his daughter to decode it with him was his own silent, clumsy way of saying something he was incapable of saying out loud. Oliver Hastings didn't do grand speeches about love, but he did invite you to sit quietly and read his dead wife's handwriting on a Tuesday morning. Robert had listened to her tell that story late that night in bed, giving her the absolute, unblinking attention he reserved for the things that ripped a piece of her heart out to say. When she finished crying quietly against his chest, he held her in a heavy silence for a long time. Then he kissed the top of her head and whispered that he completely understood the desperate urge to hide something away for 13 years, because you were terrified of losing it. He said a man can lock things in the dark for so long that he entirely forgets he's guarding them, and sometimes he can only find the key again when someone brave enough forces him to look. She knew instantly that he wasn't just talking about her father's old recipe book. The morning marched forward in the kitchen at Maple Ridge Farm with that glorious, fluid speed of days filled with good, honest work. The clock ticks, but you don't feel the hours pass because your entire soul is poured into your hands, into the rich smells, into the living dough-changing shape beneath your knuckles with every forceful fold. Robert stayed close by, occasionally stepping out into the freezing yard to bark an order at Silas or check the barn, but always returning to sit on the wooden stool near the stove, sipping his black coffee and reviewing the cattle ledgers. He carried that wonderful, anchoring presence of a man who doesn't demand your constant attention, but simply loves sharing the same air as you. He had developed a quiet new habit of always telling her exactly where he was going before he walked out the door, a tiny detail she noticed in the first few weeks, but wisely never brought up. He would stand, touch her shoulder gently, say he was heading down to the lower pasture and would be back before noon, and then he would leave. It was the desperate, beautiful habit of a man terrified of vanishing without leaving a trace. A man who finally understood that love requires you to announce your absences so the other person knows to wait for your return. It was the absolute polar opposite of a man who shoved unopened envelopes back into the mail without a single word of explanation. And Clara found a staggering poetry in that growth, that the man who once weaponized his silence to keep the world away had allowed her to teach him that the simplest, smallest words are the very things that keep the world from falling apart. When the heavy loaves were finally baked to perfection, hitting that exact glorious point she had mastered for this specific iron stove, baking at a temperature just a hair different from the brick ovens in town, and requiring exactly 10 extra minutes because the mountain altitude demanded it, Clara grabbed the thick linen cloths, pulled the scorching tins from the fire, and flipped the bread onto the wire cooling rack Robert had bolted to the counter right in front of the window, perfectly aligned with the morning sun. The crust was a violent, beautiful shade of amber. The smell that rushed up and punched the air when she tilted the tin to tap the bottom was the ultimate, undeniable confirmation. It was perfect. She called out to Robert, who was on the back porch arguing with Silas over a feed bill. He marched inside with those heavy, thudding steps she had learned to identify from miles away. Knowing the exact sound of the person you love walking toward you is one of the oldest, most profound forms of intimacy in human history, an intimacy you don't even realize you possess until the day you hear that specific footfall and feel your heart instantly settle in your chest before your brain even registers why. He stopped dead in front of the cooling rack. He tilted his head down slightly, the exact familiar gesture she knew meant he was focusing every ounce of his soul on what was in front of him. And then he spoke, using that low, vibrating voice he saved for the ultimate truths. He said it was the exact same smell, that it was the identical, flawless smell of that long-ago afternoon when a little boy walked into a bakery, and the exact same smell from the envelope that had stopped his heart in the middle of his parlor. He swore it was exactly the same, and told her it blew his mind because he had spent months terrified that his childhood memory had exaggerated the magic, that the real thing would never live up to the ghost he had chased. But it wasn't exaggerated. It was absolutely identical. Clara took the heavy knife and sliced the loaf. The crumb was flawless, the network of tiny, glossy air pockets proving the wild yeast had peaked perfectly, the gluten stretched to its absolute limit, the agonizing patience fully rewarded. She slathered a thick layer of sweet butter across the steaming slice, because that was the sacred law passed down from baker to baker since the dawn of fire. Because there are certain chemical reactions in this world that are absolutely perfect and require no modern improvement. Regardless of the year or the town you live in, Robert took the hot bread from her hand. He took a bite. He stood completely motionless, wrapping himself in that heavy, unbreakable silence she now knew how to perfectly translate. It wasn't the silence of a man calculating his escape, nor the silence of a man hiding his fear, but the holy silence of a man who is so entirely consumed by a moment of pure joy that speaking a single word would shatter the cathedral. Then he looked at her, his eyes shining with that blunt, devastating honesty that was impossible to fake, and said it was the greatest thing he had ever tasted in his life, that there was absolutely nothing on earth better than this. She smiled softly and said it was just the exact same bread she always made, that she hadn't changed a single line of her father's old recipe. He shook his head slowly. He told her it wasn't just the bread. He said the recipe might be the same, but the soul of it was different. He said maybe it was the iron stove, or the new window. Or maybe, he whispered, looking deep into her eyes, it was entirely about the person standing on the other side of the counter watching you eat it. She held his gaze with that fierce, unwavering stare that had taken him months of brutal practice to learn how to meet without flinching. And she softly told him that he was probably right, and that it was a combination of all three. Outside in the freezing yard, Silas happened to be walking past the kitchen window, hauling a heavy bucket of water for the horses, and inevitably caught the end of the exchange. The old foreman immediately quickened his pace toward the barn, executing a tactical retreat he had polished to an absolute art form over 2 years of surviving the gravitational pull of those two stubborn souls. But in the exact way his calloused hands gripped the handle of the heavy bucket, walking through the crisp November frost of 1936, with the pale sun rising over the peach trees, there was a visible, undeniable lightness, the exact posture of a hard man who is profoundly satisfied with how the day turned out. It was the stance of a man who had stood on the sidelines and watched a fragile, beautiful thing slowly turn into an indestructible, permanent reality. It was the morning of a man witnessing a miracle, and there was warm bread resting on the table, and there was the entire morning and every single morning that would ever follow, stretching out beautifully right in front of them.